Hello and welcome to The Thinking Believer. We're going to talk today about evidence for Jesus outside the Bible. In fact, we're going to talk about written evidence for Jesus that is not just outside the Bible, but that also wasn't written by Christian authors. We're going to blaze through the 9 non-Christian authors who wrote about Jesus in the first 150 years after his death, whose works still survive. In the interest of giving a good overview, today we're not going to go into much detail on these, but I'll include a few tidbits. There's a lot more that could be said about each of them, and for at least some of them, we'll probably circle back to talk in more detail in the future, so feel free to subscribe or let me know in the comments if you're interested in that specifically. We're going to go through roughly from least important to most important. Down here at number 9, we have Thallus, who is probably the earliest of the surviving non-Christian sources to mention Jesus. Sextus Julius Africanus, who has an awesome name, quotes him and says Thallus argued that the darkness that came over the world when Jesus was crucified was due to an eclipse. Coming in at number 8 is Phlegon, who sounds like he belongs in the pharmacy next to Mucinex. Phlegon is also quoted by Africanus with regard to an eclipse during the reign of Tiberius. He's also quoted by a church father named Origen in the second half of the 2nd century, saying Phlegon ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. In another place, Origen quotes Phlegon saying Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails. At number 7, we have Suetonius, who is a well-respected Roman and historian who says, because the Jews at Rome caused constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus, Claudius expelled them from Rome. There's debate over whether Christus refers to Jesus because he refers to him as Christus, but this wouldn't be the only example of a Roman historian thinking that Christ was a name, Christus, and not a title, Christ. We do know from Acts 18 that the Jews were kicked out of Rome by Claudius, as Suetonius mentions here. At number 6, we have Marabar Serapion, who doesn't refer to Jesus by name, but who talks about how the Jews killed their wise king, and it's obvious from the context that he's talking about a 1st century figure. He also says the wise king lived on in the teachings he enacted. At 5 and 4, we have 2 satirists with a low opinion of Christians, though to be honest, almost all of these authors had a low opinion of Christians who they regarded as foolish because they believed in the resurrection, or dangerous and obscene because they wouldn't worship Roman gods. The fact that these were hostile sources goes a long way to confirm their authenticity, actually. Lucian of Samosata is the first of these two, and says that the Christians worshipped a man who they viewed as a lawgiver and who was a crucified sage. He also says that Christians didn't care about death because of their belief in life after death, and that they despised worldly goods. I mean, they didn't care about worldly goods is basically what he means in fancy talk. Celsus says Jesus came from a village in Judea and was the son of a poor Jewess. He possessed powers, which Celsus says he got while in Egypt, and with these powers, he basically pretended to be God. He gave himself out to be God. In the 3rd spot, we have Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman senator and a friend of the emperor, and is coincidentally also our best source on the eruption of Vesuvius, if you watched the video from last week. He writes to the emperor asking what to do with all the Christians who sing hymns as Christ, as to God, as to a God, and who refuse to worship the Roman gods. He thinks he should probably kill them, but he's not sure. He also talks about the high moral code of the Christians and that they met regularly for worship. Josephus, our number 2, was born in Jerusalem just a few years after the crucifixion, which puts him in close proximity to a lot of eyewitnesses. He mentions Jesus in 2 different places, but unfortunately, one of the 2 passages referring to Jesus was corrupted by a Christian scribe a couple centuries later, who embellished what Josephus had said about Jesus, so it's hard to know what was original to Josephus. We'll probably do a video in more detail on the first reference to Jesus and what, if anything, we can learn from it sometime in the future. Josephus also just had a fascinating life, and so we might dive into that too. But for now, we'll just focus on the second mention, which fortunately is considered by most scholars to be uncorrupted. It talks about the death of James the Just, who is described as the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. And in the number 1 slot, we have Tacitus, one of the best respected Roman historians and a source for a lot of what we know about ancient Rome. He writes that the Emperor Nero tortured Christians, a group named after their leader, Christus, which is another example of a Roman historian mistaking the title Christ for a name, Christus, and that this leader of the Christians, Christ, was put to death by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. So altogether, there are 9 non-Christian authors who wrote about Jesus in the first 150 years after his death. To the modern mind, that might not seem like very much by contemporary standards, but for a point of reference, let's look at Tiberius Caesar, who was emperor when Jesus lived. He was probably the most famous man in the world alive at the time, and within the first 150 years after his death, there were 9 non-Christian authors who wrote about him. So, excluding Christian authors, there are 9 sources for Jesus and 9 for Tiberius. Now, the non-Christian sources for Tiberius are admittedly better than the non-Christian sources for Jesus, but let's look at it this way. If you include Christian sources, that gives Tiberius one more mention in the first 150 years, a mention in Luke, bringing his total number of authors to 10. If you include Christian sources for Jesus, there are 42 references to him in the first 150 years. That includes the 9 secular authors that we talked about a minute ago, 9 writers in the New Testament, 20 Christians who didn't write any of the books of the Bible but wrote in the first 150 years, and 4 heretical authors who didn't hold Orthodox Christian beliefs. That gives Jesus 4 times as much documentary evidence as Tiberius, and some sources of incredibly high quality. So Jesus has a huge amount of documentary evidence. So a couple disclaimers. I am not saying that there's more evidence for Jesus than there is for Tiberius. There are other kinds of evidence for Tiberius that we don't have for Jesus because of Tiberius's position. For example, we have coins minted with Tiberius's picture on them. There are statues of Tiberius. There's some inscriptions, which is what you'd expect from the emperor of the largest empire on earth. Jesus, the rabbi from Judea, wasn't minting a lot of coins. The second disclaimer is that this does not prove that Jesus was the Son of God or that he rose from the dead or performed miracles. What this does illustrate is just how much written evidence we actually have for Jesus by ancient standards. If Tiberius really existed, which he did, and was one of the best known people in the world, which he was, and he only has 10 authors who mention him in the first 150 years after his death, then we should have no problem believing that Jesus, who is mentioned by just as many secular sources and 4 times as many sources, including Christians, is also a historical figure. Among tenured historians, Jesus is pretty much universally considered to be a historical figure, and I only say pretty much because I don't want someone to pull out the singular example to the contrary. I really am almost certain that it's unanimously believed among tenured historians. Now, just because all the experts on a subject are in agreement doesn't necessarily make them right, but if someone wants to argue that Jesus never existed, they have got, frankly, a big hill to climb. If you enjoy learning about this stuff as much as I do, please stick around. I'm trying to get new videos out weekly, but if it's too hard to remember to check back in, you can subscribe or set up notifications for when I release new content. And of course, you can tell me all the ways I'm wrong in the comment section below, or if you've got something friendly to say, I'm told that's allowed there too. Have a great day, and I will see you next week.